Hello everyone, today we'll talk about private property and the socialism. In a way, this is kinda a part 2 to my How Libertarians Are One Step Away from Marxism video. Private property under socialism is a very interesting topic because you'd assume that private property is abolished under socialism, although it isn't, and although all Marxist-Leninist leaders like Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Mao, Hoxha, and many others tried to abolish private property, they all failed and private property always existed under socialism thus. In this video, we will mainly focus on private property in the Soviet Union under Stalin and on private property in Maoist China, as those are the most well-known and most brought up examples of socialist countries, and since countries like post-Stalin USSR, on which I made a billion videos anyway already, and the Eastern Bloc after 1956 are controversial, we won't talk about them. We will split this video into two sections. We will first talk about private agriculture under socialism in Stalin's USSR and Maoist China, and then in the second section, we'll talk about markets and private businesses in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Alright, now we arrive at agriculture. Now, before we start, I'd like to address that collective farms are cooperatives. To quote the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, collective farms in the USSR are cooperative organizations of voluntary united peasants for the joint management of large-scale socialist agricultural production on the basis of public means of production and collective labor. See collectivization of agriculture. If you didn't know, cooperatives are essentially just markets. So, as we can see, collective farms are markets, and agriculture in the USSR and Maoist China was almost fully a market sector or private. They both objectively collectivized. I don't think that anyone will deny that. I'll still quote Stalin and Mao just for those new to Marxism. The fundamental task of the 5-year plan was to transfer small and scattered agriculture onto the lines of large scale collective farming, so as to ensure the economic basis of socialism in the countryside and thus to eliminate the possibility of the restoration of capitalism in the USSR. Joseph Stalin, the results of the first 5-year plan. Also, since I can't find a quote by Mao on collectivization in China under him, I'll just quote Wikipedia. There we go. To facilitate the mobilization of agricultural resources, improve the efficiency of farming, and increase government access to agricultural products, the authorities encouraged farmers to organize cooperative farming, starting in 1953. There was a private sector in agriculture in the Soviet Union under Stalin. To quote a book, about 1/4 of Soviet agricultural production still comes from the private farming plots. These specialize in potatoes, contributing about 65% of total output, other vegetables about 40% of total, meat and milk 35% of total, and eggs 50% of total output. See Diamond Kruger. The dependency on private plots was even greater in the pre-war period. In 1937, when conditions in the socialist sector were very good indeed, privately operated plots provided 52.1% of the total output of potatoes and vegetables, and 56.6% of that of fruit. For animal products, the corresponding percentages were milk 71.4%, meat 70.9%, height 70.4%, wool 43%. This is The Myth of Capitalism Reborn by David Dyke, page 33. As we can see, private farming plots played a big role in Soviet agriculture, making up 1/4 of agricultural output in 1937. A fact worth noting is that class antagonism, kulaks, and the bourgeoisie had been abolished along with other elements in 1936, so saying that the Soviet Union somehow had kulaks at the time is nonsense. To quote Stalin, unlike bourgeois constitutions, the draft of the new constitution of the USSR proceeds from the fact that there are no longer any antagonistic classes in society, that society consists of two friendly classes, workers and peasants, that it is these classes, the laboring classes, that are in power, that the guidance of society by the state, the dictatorship, is in the hands of the working class, the most advanced class in society, that the constitution is needed for the purpose of consolidating a social order desired by and beneficial to the working people. Joseph Stalin on the draft constitution of the USSR. But in the USSR there are no longer such classes as the capitalists, the landlords, the kulaks, etc. In the USSR there are only two classes, the workers and peasants, whose interests, far from being mutually hostile, are on the contrary friendly. Joseph Stalin on the draft constitution of the USSR. Now, I could show you even more quotes by Stalin if you want, which proves that class antagonism, kulaks, and the bourgeoisie, along with other elements, had been abolished in 1936. But I think that this is enough. If you want to learn more about that, just watch episode 1 of my post-Stalin USSR series. What was the maximum size of the private farming plots? To quote an article, plots. It was a legally defined agricultural unit in the Soviet Union. It refers to a small plot of land, usually less than 0.5 hectares, adjacent to the residences on collective farms. No maximum area was assigned to the plots at the time. It was all a work in progress. This was not worked out until the Kolkhoz Model Charter was issued February 1935. It is at this time that the area was set at 1/4 to 1/2 hectare. This was usually smaller than the area allocated during the Tsarist times. There were some up to 1 hectare, but only in special districts. The legislation established individual peasants as the holders, but in practice plots were continued to be household tenure. The answer is 0.5 hectares and in special cases 1 hectare. I'd also like to mention that private garden plots were very important in Soviet agriculture as well. To quote an article, the private garden plots were responsible for a stunning fraction of Soviet agricultural production. They provided Soviet collective workers with a substantial part of both their food and income. Despite the minuscule area of the private garden plots, they accounted for over 20% of agricultural produce. 1938. What about Mao's China? Mao did abolish private farming plots during the Great Leap Forward, but he eventually brought them back in 1962 as abolishing them failed. To quote an article, although private farming plots of land were reinstated in 1962 due to this failure, communes remained the dominant rural unit of economic organization during the Cultural Revolution, with Mao championing the Learn from Tachai campaign. Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Mao all tried to abolish private farming plots, yet failed. Now we arrive at the section of markets and private businesses under socialism. Only used the Soviet Union under Stalin, not during the NEP, but in the socialist period of the Soviet Union, as an example of how markets and private businesses can exist under socialism. We will exclude Mao's China from this section, as all markets and all private businesses were abolished in China under Mao by the end of the first 5-year plan in China in around 1957 or 1958, with the exception of agriculture. Let's actually quote a few articles which prove the existence of markets and cooperatives under Stalin in the Soviet Union. To quote some, despite the war, in a number of sectors, market relations have become entrenched. They have already been uprooted by Khrushchev. They interfered with the formalized class of the party farm nomenclature. This is, by the way, in an article which is titled The Stalinist Market. Anyway, to quote an article again, as it now sounds not strange, but in the Stalinist era of the USSR, the cooperative movement was being developed. Even during the most difficult conditions of the war, cooperatives retained a significant part of the advances, and after the end of the war, during the Reconstruction period, they were expanded again. The development of artels was considered an important state task to help the artels in the restoration of the state. What I believe is worth mentioning, as one of the quotes said, is that Nikita Khrushchev actually abolished all the markets and private businesses that existed in the Soviet Union. If you want to, find out more about that, just watch episode 5 of my post-Stalin USSR series. I'll put the link to that and of episode 1 of my post-Stalin USSR series in the description down below. I think that this is enough for there being markets in the Soviet Union under Stalin. However, I'd still like to cite Stalin as proof as well of their existing more markets in the Soviet Union. We are the biggest market in the world. Joseph Stalin talked with Mr. Durante, correspondent of the New York Times. This is an insane quote to take in. The reason behind why Stalin said this is because the USSR had small and medium-sized markets and cooperatives. Libertarians opposed monopolies because of unfair competition. Well, guess what? Socialism solves that problem. Socialism creates a favorable and efficient environment for small and medium-sized markets to exist and for market competition. So, if you're a libertarian watching this video, then I'd recommend you to just change your ideology if you really want fair competition. There is no excuse. The quote by Stalin is from 1934. Socialism already existed in 1931, according to Stalin. To quote him, a system that is free from the incurable diseases of capitalism and has great advantages over capitalism, crises, unemployment, waste, destitution among the masses. Such are the incurable diseases of capitalism. Our system does not suffer from these diseases, because power is in our hands, in the hands of the working class, because we are conducting a planned economy, systematically accumulating resources and properly distributing them among the different branches of the national economy. We are free from the incurable diseases of capitalism. This is what distinguishes us from capitalism. This is what constitutes our decisive superiority over capitalism. Notice the way in which the capitalists are trying to escape from the economic crisis. They are reducing the workers' wages as much as possible. They are reducing the prices of raw materials as much as possible, but they do not want to reduce the prices of food and industrial commodities for mass consumption to any important extent. This means that they want to escape from the crisis at the expense of the principal consumers, at the expense of the workers and peasants, at the expense of the working people. The capitalists are cutting the ground from under their own feet, and instead of overcoming the crises, they are aggravating it. New conditions are accumulating, which lead to a new, even more severe crisis. Our superiority lies in the fact that we have no crises of overproduction. We have not and will never have millions of unemployed. We have no anarchy in production, for we are conducting a planned economy. The quote is from 1931, so yeah, also what I said before also applies to private businesses. There were small and medium-sized private businesses under Stalin, and socialism solves the problem of unfair competition by creating a good environment for them to exist and market competition. To quote a few articles. So, a small business called a corporation gave at least 6% of industrial products before the war, including 40% of furniture, 70% of metal utensils, and almost all toys. At 114,000 industrial enterprises in Moscow in 1936, there were 15,000, worked 1.8 million people. The first Soviet tube receivers since 1930, radios since 1935, and televisions since 1939 were produced by the Leningrad Artel Progress Radio. In the business sector, there were about 100 design bureaus, 22 bureaus, I think it's called, 22 experimental laboratories, and even 2 research institutes. The industrial corporation had its own pension system, which the village was deprived of. consumer, and even housing loans. Its benefits are beyond today's benefits of small business and its leaders, in addition to the profits encouraged along with the industrial leaders of comparable level. Now, this is a lot of information to take in. Before World War II, private businesses accounted for around 6% of industrial output in the Soviet Union, including 40% of furniture, 70% of metal utensils, and almost all toys. Lots of Soviet tubes, radios, and TVs were also produced by a private business called Progress Radio, stationed in Leningrad. There were 100 design bureaus, 22 experimental laboratories, and 2 research institutes in the private sector. So those were all private businesses. Private businesses also had their own pension system. The most shocking fact of all, though, is that there were 114,000 private enterprises under Stalin. 15,000 in Moscow in 1936 and 1.8 million workers in the private sector. We will talk more about the 114,000 number later several times. There is also an article which says the exact same thing as this one, to quote it. As the then called small and medium-sized businesses, which quickly responded to the requests of the workers of the USSR at the time of Joseph Stalin's death, there were 114,000 private workshops and private enterprises in the USSR in various fields, from the food industry to metalworking, and from jewelry to the chemical industry. They employed about 2 million people, who produced almost 6% of the gross industrial output of the USSR, and the small private businesses and industrial corporations produced 40% of furniture, 70% of metal utensils, more than a third of all knitwear, and almost all children's toys. In the business sector, there were about 100 design bureaus, 22 experimental laboratories, and even 2 research institutes. Moreover, within the framework of the sector, there was its own non-state pension system. A few facts worth mentioning from here is that private businesses produced jewelry and a third of nightwear, and it was in 1953 under Stalin, when 114,000 private enterprises existed. Let's further quote in another article to prove this. There were 114,000 private workshops and private enterprises of various directions, from the food industry to metalworking, and from jewelry to the chemical industry. Now, I know that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is pretty controversial. However, I think that it's still worth quoting them on private property in Stalin's USSR. We'll first talk about private property in the USSR under Stalin before World War II, so in the 1930s, then during the war, and lastly after the Great Patriotic War, to quote the KPRF. Interestingly, the private sector was not only engaged in manufacturing. Dozens of design bureaus, experimental laboratories, and even 2 research institutes worked in the private sector. As a result, in the USSR during the Stalin's period, entrepreneurship was not only not infringed on, but on the contrary, encouraged. It was an important sector of the national economy and was actively developing and improving. It is also important to note that it was productive entrepreneurship that grew, and not the parasitic speculative entrepreneurship that proliferated during the NAP years and was restored during the Gorbachev Katastroika and the liberal destructive reforms of the 1990s. Under Stalin's totalitarianism, private initiative and creativity were encouraged in every way possible, as it benefited the state and the people. Private enterprises made the economy of the USSR more stable. It seemed that under Stalin, when the NAP ended, collectivization and industrialization were carried out. The artel cooperatives will disappear. However, the opposite was true. In the Stalinist empire, entrepreneurship experienced a new flourishing. Small-scale production in the Stalinist USSR was a very strong and noticeable sector of the national economy of the country. Artels during the Great Patriotic War even produced weapons and ammunition. That is, they had high technologies and their own production facilities. In the USSR, production and fishing artels were were supported in every way possible and in every possible way. Already in the course of the first 5-year plan, the growth of the members of the artels was funded by 2.6 times. In 1941, the Soviet government protected the artels from the excessive interference of the authorities, pointed to the mandatory election of the management of production cooperatives at all levels, and for 2 years freed the enterprises from all taxes and state control over retail pricing. Essentially, it repeats some stuff from before and also says that the private sector didn't just exist in manufacturing but also in other sectors. Private property, markets, and entrepreneurship were even encouraged. They actively improved, developed, made the economy more stable. They expanded a lot, especially in and after World War II, but also during the first 5-year plan, where its workforce expanded by 2.6 times. The markets and the private businesses also flourished and were a strong sector of the Soviet economy. However, these private businesses and markets, as the article notes, aren't the same as the private businesses and markets that existed under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. These enterprises were regulated and had no exploitation. However, they were also protected from excessive interference by the state, which essentially meant that these businesses and cooperatives didn't really have central planning, and that they were nationalized, and they were even freed in World War II from all taxes and prices were liberalized. In World War II, they even produced weapons, ammunition, and technology. Let's now further talk about markets and private businesses in World War II, and also after World War II. And in the years of the war, the private sector established the production of weapons from already made components, made boxes for ammunition, ammunition for soldiers and horses, etc. Even during the most difficult conditions of the war, cooperatives retained a significant part of the allowances, and after the end of the war, during the reconstruction period, they were expanded again. The development of artels was considered an important state task to help the artels in the restoration of the state. To summarize, the private sector made weapons from already produced components, boxes for ammunition, ammunition for soldiers and horses and more. The cooperatives and private businesses even existed during the Second World War and during Reconstruction after World War II and were even expanded. It was a very important task to develop them, which the state did. Anyway, now I'd like to talk about private housing and the Stalin. Here is a graph of housing in the Soviet Union and Russian Federation from 1918 to 2007. The blue shows public housing and the red private housing. It shows how many square kilometers of the USSR's territory private and public housing took in. As you can see, private housing existed throughout the entirety of the Soviet Union. And also, can you see the green circle I made? At one point in around mid-1937, around 90%, yes, 90% of housing was private. That's 1 year after class antagonism, the bourgeoisie, the kulaks and all their elements had been abolished in the USSR. Let that sink in. Even Scandinavia in the 1970s had more public housing in percentage than that. And we're talking about the Soviet Union here. Now it's time to slowly end this video. I hope you enjoyed it and hope that it was very informative. Like, share and subscribe and put the bell on if you did. Sources are in the pinned comment of the comment section and my 2 post-Stalin USSR videos are in the description down below. If you want to learn more about private property and markets and the socialism, I'd recommend reading more about Hungary under János Kádár, especially in the 1980s. So if you're interested in private farming plots and decollectivized farming under socialism, then socialist Poland after 1956 is what you're looking for. If you want to read upon a country which had all of these things, then I'd recommend reading upon China under Deng Xiaoping from 1978 to 1984 with the exception of Shenzhen. I will eventually cover China under Deng Xiaoping on my channel. I have also been thinking about making a video about socialist Poland's agriculture after 1956 and Hungary under János Kádár, but I, as a Russian Marxist-Leninist, believe that this would be unfair for me to do. So I will leave the job to I will leave the job to Polish and Hungarian Marxist YouTubers. And if you want a very radical example of private property under socialism, then I'd recommend reading upon China under Deng Xiaoping from 1984 to 1997. But this is a very radical example, as China had actual capitalist enterprises with exploitation under him in this time. I'll eventually cover that as well. Though, at the time in China, the dominant mode of production was still socialism. So, yeah. Well, anyway, guys, see you in my next video. Bye.